Good morning or good afternoon, as it were, depending on where you're geographically located, and welcome to Secrets from the Crime Lab, an educational podcast where we discuss forensic science and related scientific fields and topics. I'm your host, Angela Swartz, and joining me today, I have two professors from the University of Northumbria, Dr. Carol McCartney and Dr. Matthias Wienroth, and I'm expecting you're going to have to correct me on your name pronunciation yet again. Would you like to go first? Introduce yourself?
Sure thing. Thank you very much, Angela. Yeah, my name is Matthias Wienroth, and I'm a senior research fellow at the University of Northumbria at Newcastle in the UK. I'm particularly interested in the study of sciences and technologies, biosciences and biotechnologies from a social scientific perspective. So I'm interested in the social and ethical aspects of how we produce knowledge using particular types of biotechnologies. One of the areas that I'm particularly interested in is forensic genetics, and that's the reason why I'm on your podcast. And another is healthcare. So where a lot of the very similar issues come together around knowledge about the human body and about the way that technologies are used to create and recreate social order. And that's, of course, particularly interesting when it comes to criminal justice and the investigation of crimes, just how technologies there contribute to social order. For example, through the production of new types of suspect identities, or the way that these technologies can produce forms of intelligence or evidence. I'm interested in just the way that these kinds of various different types of biotechnologies, particularly in forensic genetics, contribute to this social order that is the beginning and the end of the criminal justice system.
Yes, thank you for coming on. Carol, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hi, pleasure to be here. So I'm Dr. Carol McCartney, and I would say I've probably almost 20 years now studying criminal justice systems, but with a particular focus on miscarriages of justice. And of course, that has then led to a focus on forensic science, and particularly biometrics, DNA, fingerprints, and so forth. But really looking at the whole sort of gamut of forensic science we call it from cradle to grave, although I think the Americans say from soup to nuts. That was an
Yes.
expression that I liked. So yeah, interested really in all aspects of forensic science, but particularly, of course, its impact on justice.
So it turns out that I thought my first introduction to both of you was this paper that prompted me to contact you to begin with. And it's in Genes, Ethics as a Lived Practice, Anticipatory Capacity and Ethical Decision-Making in Forensic Genetics. And from my experience as a forensic genetics professional, we're really not focusing as much as we need to on the ethical side of things. I think in your paper you commented that it does seem like a perfunctory administrative step that you go through rather than something that we should be keeping in mind at all times when we're doing our work. And then I hadn't realized when I started to look further into both of your bodies of research, I'd actually read your work before, Carol, the work that you did with the Newfield Council, the report on the bioethics that you did on forensic science a long time ago.
I love that. Yes, it makes me feel old now when people bring that up.
But still relevant.
It is still relevant. And that was back in 2007. The question is, have we progressed as a field since then? Have we gotten better, or because of all of these new emerging technologies that we have, the forensic DNA phenotyping and biogeographical ancestry and forensic epigenetics, all of these new technologies, and then you have cases like the Golden Gate Killer in San Francisco that kind of puts a lot of these things more in the forefront of the public eye. Forensics wasn't really keeping up with ethical decision-making to begin with, compared with the medical community. And the speed at which technology is moving, are we still behind the curve?
Well, it's interesting, of course. We say that was a long time ago. And like you say, things have moved on. I think that the wonderful thing about that report was it was a point at which we took stock and said, hang on, let's have a look at what we're doing here, because we had the MARPA case going through the European Court of Human Rights. So it was a juncture at which we said, we've got this new technology, we've raced ahead with it, we've built this massive database, we're taking DNA from people left, right and centre. Perhaps we should stop and have a think about this. So it was great at the time, and we had the MARPA ruling. I think my concern then for that was wonderful, but two things have happened that I think there's a feeling that we dealt with the ethics then, that we had MARPA, we've had that report, we've done that. So we thought about the ethics and that's all sorted. The other thing that I think has happened, which kind of led to the paper that you mentioned, is that people have delegated it. So they have appreciated the ethical questions surround all of this, around forensic science in the criminal justice process and in society. But they think that's somebody else's job. There's people out there that will deal with that. So the Nuffield Council on Bioethics, they wrote a report, so that's good. But there's other people whose job it is to deal with this. So it's not actually a concern for us because someone somewhere else is dealing with that. So I think we haven't moved up, we haven't moved along, and we haven't kept up with the times, and we haven't kept under constant review the developments and the, new technologies and new techniques. But we've also thought that it's been dealt with and now it's somebody else's job, but it doesn't actually, I'm not convinced that the forensic community, and obviously I don't know them all personally, but the sense you get is ethics is somebody else's job. And so that, I guess, is one concern, yeah.
That is also one of the concerns that led us to writing this paper, the concern that Carol just raised, this kind of disconnect. Yes, we need to talk about ethics, and then the actual implementation of what it means to think and act ethically in forensic genetics. And that's a starting point for the paper, where we make the distinction between what you describe as more bureaucratic type of ethics, what we describe as thin ethics. A really, really thin understanding of ethics is something that can be a hurdle that is in the way, but essentially is a tick box exercise that people might find annoying and just disruptive of the actual scientific and investigative process. And we want to say ethical decision making is something that we do all the time, and we just need to become more aware of it and just how it impacts on our daily practices. As such, it's not a hurdle and it's not a tick box exercise. Ethics as lived practice is literally reflecting on how we make decisions, what kind of principles, what kind of standards we apply, what standards we consider to be legitimate in the way that we make decisions. And even if we find ourselves making decisions where we don't think it's a big issue, it's a big problem, it's not really a dilemma, we are still making decisions that can have far-reaching effects. For example, when you make a decision about what reference data you use, it might seem to you at that point when you make that decision, this is really just a matter of like a procedural matter. I'm using this particular type of reference data because this database has the data available, easily accessible, and I can work with it. But the way that the data have been compiled and have been curated might have longer term effects on just how reliable and how useful, and essentially also how legitimate the technologies and the knowledge they produce can be. In the end, a simple decision might have really long-reaching effects. And we can see this happening at the time, but we can talk about examples a little bit later on as well.
Just in a general sense, I know that a lot of us that, just day-to-day practicing forensic geneticists, you do just use the information that's available to perform that one thing that you're trying to do, whether you're just doing a basic calculation based on population databases that were compiled from different groups. But you don't really, once you have it in place, you don't really think about where did it come from? Are there any issues with it? Is it skewed because we've oversampled a particular population over another because we could exploit that population by not really getting the informed consent that we needed to do it?
Yes, a related issue is, of course, that there are certain populations which are favored populations for data. An example is the Roma population in Europe, whose data have often been sampled and then used in the criminal justice system, where prejudices have contributed, not just social prejudices, as in, the Roma, they are traveling people, some might say, prone to criminal activity. That is a social prejudice, but also scientific prejudice. For example, saying, well, this seems to be a very confined, genetically speaking, confined population where we can get really good, pure data, whatever that might mean. And that, of course, is also not correct, because when you are living across a whole range of European states, and of course, you will have intermixed with a whole range of the European population. So even the scientific prejudice there can undermine the strength of the data that has been compiled and on which certain analytical models are then being developed.
Well, and maybe that's why some of these analytical models are not holding up when you test them. So when we look at forensic DNA phenotyping, it's off. I mean, it's not off all the time, but it's off enough for you to be very concerned about whether or not you're getting legitimate or valid information. And then, of course, if you're already working on top of social prejudices that might exist and you're providing that information to law enforcement, are they then getting tunnel vision and focusing on searching for the wrong individual or convincing themselves that they need to go to this particular group of people to find their perpetrator?
Yeah, I mean, you bring together different steps along the range of knowledge production, of how meaning is produced using, for example, forensic DNA phenotyping. I started out with what's the reference data that you build your models on, and you already jump forward then to the point of okay, and now you apply these models in your analysis, and now you try to communicate information to investigators. How can they deal with the information? What will they do with the information? Will they, make it public and say, oh, look, there's this particular population group that we think we can find the suspect or the perpetrator in, and possibly not, necessarily understanding or thinking about the impact this might have on that population itself, which might start from something that seems relatively innocuous, such as saying, well, we think the perpetrator comes from your community, so now we expect you have to go the extra mile to help us in our investigation. So that means you have to give us your DNA so we can compare it. Really, there is no expectation that they would have to give the DNA, as just an example, if you were not from that population necessarily. So these are, some of the examples that can happen, that we have seen happen in the UK and in the US and elsewhere. Genetic information points into a certain direction, and then those kinds of populations are being particularly subjected to scrutiny, which might make sense perhaps from an investigative point of view, but it does bring along things like, guilty by association ideas, and potentially also, as we've seen in 2016 and 2017, attitudes of the population towards minorities, where forensic genetics and forensic geneticists had a really precarious role to play in fueling prejudices, public prejudices, political prejudices, and not always lived up to the requirement to do so in order to protect people who are innocent, but who by association fall under suspicion.
So do you think that, and I think you touched on it a little bit in your paper, it's the pressure, there's also an enormous amount of pressure on the scientists to ensure that all these fancy new genetic methodologies that we have can actually produce results that then they can use in crime and policing issues. One of the things is, do you propose all of the new possibilities around things like the forensic DNA phenotyping and the investigative genetic genealogy and all these types of things, especially in the biogeographical ancestry as well? Do you push it to your ultimate customer, which would be the law enforcement agencies and the prosecution services, or the governments in general, in order to get funding to be able to function as well? Is funding an issue? I know in a lot of other areas of medicine as well, there's this push to, I need to get funding if I'm going to be able to continue to do my research and develop these methods to produce the results.
I think there's a very real issue about how ethical it can possibly be to be pushing technologies that aren't going to be that effective, that are perhaps riven with risks. So risks that Matthias has already highlighted, but just plain risks of being wrong or misleading, or you're giving highly, data with an enormous amount of caveats that need attaching to it. So you mentioned phenotyping, biogeographic stuff. You can't give that information to an investigator who, with all the will in the world, is not a geneticist, a forensic scientist, and so forth. if you go giving them information and then saying, oh, but there's all these caveats attached to it, what do you expect that investigator to be able to do with that? Go along with all the caveat? Like, it's almost meaningless to give them information that's just not going to assist them. And they'll probably strip away all the caveats and say, oh, you told me it was somebody who's 5'6" and of black origin, and so that's what I'm going to look for. And so you can't then wash your hands when they go and arrest a load of people that look like the person you said it was going to look like. So, and then what happens when they don't catch them? They turn around and go, oh, your technology was rubbish. So it's not even, there's no point to you developing technologies that have to be blanketed in caveats or are so sophisticated that you can't understand it really without some statistical background, or it's going to be beyond the wit of most, with all the will in the world and as generous as you might be to investigators, that they're not going to be able to handle sophisticated data. And realistically, think about, there's a murder investigation, I want to catch a suspect. Giving me a list of, perhaps he might have come from the Caribbean. Realistically, how helpful is that? It strikes me as it's really not all that helpful. It's only going to be of minor assistance, perhaps in the odd case here and there. So how much should we really be investing in pushing that technology?
Stay with us. We'll be right back.
Hey there, everyone, and thank you again for listening to an episode of Secrets from the Crime Lab. I wanted to take a moment to ask you for your support, because if you're like me, you're not a fan of ads interrupting your shows. But in order for Secrets from the Crime Lab to remain ad-free, I need your help. So if you would like to support the show, there are 3 different ways that you can help the show right now. First, and perhaps the simplest thing that you can do, is just to share it with your friends. Get the word out. That will help a lot. Share our little science corner of the universe. The second thing you could do is maybe consider making a one-time donation. Or the third thing, become a paid subscriber, and that starts at as little as $3 a month. It's super easy to do. The links are in the show notes and whatever podcast app you're using to listen to the show, or you can go directly to secretsfromthecrimelab.com and click on the little support button with the heart on it. Every little bit helps to cover the production costs, and thank you again for listening, and I hope you learned something new today.
Yeah, I think the issue with those highly specialized technologies that Carol, you just made that reference, that they're highly specialized, and you do need quite significant insight in order to communicate them well to potential users such as investigators, and also where the statistic or the probabilistic basis of the findings are so complex. Forensic scientists have been talking for some years now about how they could potentially translate the kind of likelihood ratios and other approaches that they prefer, because they are more precise than alternative forms of communicating probabilities, how they can be made understood. We know from research and experience, the judiciary and juries and barristers, solicitors and police officers, investigators and so forth, that, if you throw at them a likelihood ratio, they don't know what that means. It's just super complicated. And often there's not necessarily the time made to communicate what that means. So investigators and others might be looking for information that they understand. And if, like certain companies in North America, provide an image and really easily accessible visual graphics of information, skin color, hair color, eye color, freckles, and so on and so forth, then of course they'll go with that information thinking that this is reliable information, especially when there's also information from scientists sometimes saying, well, in the ideal case, this is reliable to 99.9%. But what that actually means is, under ideal laboratory conditions, the way that the technology works is very high. But in the, if I may call it, the real world of contamination and decomposition of DNA samples and mixtures of DNA samples and so on and so forth, those really high reliability rates, of course, don't apply anymore. And it can be quite difficult to then tell an investigator or a politician who's called for the use of these technologies, well, actually, that's not the same thing. Using forensic DNA phenotyping in a criminal case will only be useful in a very small number of cases. Very rare if you don't have any eyewitnesses or you don't have any other circumstantial evidence to point into the direction of a potential perpetrator. Then you might use it. But then also to say, well, actually, the reliability of this technology is based on various different factors, which we now need to talk through as well in order for you to get a good understanding of just how reliable this technology is. And this is a point where this notion of reliability meets the notion of utility, just how useful it is. And Carol raised this as well. Just how useful can this technology be? What needs to be the context within which it can be useful? It raises also another issue that Carol has written about, and that's integrity of the scientist, of the forensic caseworker. And they need to be able to communicate when a particular technology is useful or when it isn't. They need to be able to be transparent about the utility and the reliability of the particular technology at hand. I just want to briefly mention something, and I think, Carol, you might be able to say a little bit more about the Sydney Declaration. There was a paper published earlier this year, and a number of forensic scientists have come together and written a list of 7 principles, I believe it is, about what forensic genetics is and what needs to be taken into consideration here. And throughout those principles, one word comes up time and again, which I found so interesting, and that's context. So very important, determining whether something is useful, but also to determine in how far you can give information. What knowledge can you give to investigators? What is it worth for the investigation? The 7th principle talks a little bit about the ethics of forensic scientists, probably not as much as we would like them to, but it basically says it's an ethical responsibility of scientists to understand context and distinguish it from analytical data. So yes, you need to know about context, but you mustn't let the context influence your analysis to such a degree that you're generating an analysis which speaks to the requirements, very closely to the requirements of what the investigator wants to know. Rather, you should develop an analysis that speaks for and of itself, aware of the context, but not mixing it up too much with the context. And then to be able to communicate the differences between the context and the analytical data that comes out of applying a particular methodology. I thought this was a really interesting way, even though they don't really mention terms such as utility and reliability and integrity, but it's an early starting point for thinking about ethics as lived practice, because we know that it can be very difficult to look at everyday activities that we all do and that forensic scientists, forensic geneticists do when they develop technologies and when they apply them, to reflect on all the decisions that are actually going on, that are being made. And it can be something as simple as saying, okay, I need to understand the context within which this trace was found. It will help me to do the analysis, but I also need to reflect on just how much this context might drive my analysis and whether it might color the information that might then come out in such a way that the information might not be, as independent, or whether it might be written for a particular viewpoint, if you know what I mean. I'm kind of trying carefully to phrase this here.
I always think it, just in terms of my head, to put things simply, I reflect on genetically modified foods. In that, if you talk to me about it in a laboratory setting, that we can tweak these genes to this plant and then increase the yield of this crop, whatever, I'm like, fabulous, that's great. Great scientific development. Okay, we're now going to change all the genetics of all these plants in this field here. Well, hang on a minute. And this is where the debate starts, because it's that difference between what can I do in a laboratory, what happens when it's out in the wild, okay? And you can't divorce yourself, or I believe, and I'm sure Matthias and our other authors believe, you can't divorce yourself from what's going to happen to that technology in the wild by saying, oh, but I'm in a laboratory and it's fine in a laboratory, because what's the point of it in the laboratory? It has to go out into the wild for there to be a point to it. So when you're developing your phenotyping or your biogeographic ancestry testing and so forth, you have to take that extra step and think, what's going to happen to this in the wild? And that's where the context is massively important. So you can't let it influence really the science that you're doing, but you can't divorce yourself from the ethical implications of what's going to happen to that technology out in the wild.
Yeah, so you mentioned GMOs and genetic modifications. I think you can look beyond food crops at this point with the CRISPR technology that's out, right? So you have the ability to go in and, let's fix these mutations that are specifically associated to cystic fibrosis, for example, which would be amazing for people that have it. But moving on from that, you could actually go and do designer babies, right? Which isn't really something that you would, I can cure these diseases and these people can live normal, more healthy lives for longer periods of time. But then there's going to be somebody out there that's going to go, well, I want my baby to look like this. So we are actually to the point where that's a possibility. But if you go back to what you were saying with people that are actually doing the work in the laboratory, I think there is very much a focus on the technical aspect. We're focused on what we're doing. I have to produce a result. I have to produce a report. And even if they are looking at how is my information going to be received by the investigator, even if you're concerned about that, a lot of times that communication doesn't come back towards the scientist. So the scientist provides information. They say, I'm available if you have any questions. I'm happy to further explain this and talk about the limitations related to my findings. But the investigators a lot of times don't come back. Like you said, they strip it away to the information that they think is the most pertinent without all of the caveats. And then, of course, a lot of times your DNA reports are just read into the record in the courtroom. They don't even ask you to go to court. It's the defense isn't taking any issues with the findings. They're happy to accept the information. And so the case moves forward without any scientist involved in it whatsoever. And of course, that's a big problem when we talk about the misuse of the genetic information or it's not necessarily a misstatement by experts, but it's a misunderstanding by legal experts, and it can lead to miscarriages of justice, right?
Yeah, well, we even instigated a process in this country called streamlined forensic reporting. The idea being, well, we know DNA testing is reliable. We know it's effective. We can do this quite easily. It's all done on a computer. Realistically, what's the problem with just printing out a report that says match? Okay. And that saves time, saves money, and then we won't be bothered with any forensic scientist getting involved, having to write reports, and they cost money and it takes time. So we have a system whereby a laboratory will print out a result that says this is a match. Okay, that gets put on one side of A4 that gets given to the investigators. That then, of course, will be given to any suspect and their legal advisor saying, oh, we've got your DNA. Okay, at the scene, or we've got your DNA on somewhere pertinent. And then you've already shifted the burden then onto you're now going to have to explain that. And of course, 9 times out of 10 lawyers will go, oh, well, they found your DNA. Okay. And so we've talked to some scientists who have then, this has to be unpicked. And it turns out it's not that good a match, or it's actually a mixture, or actually it was found on something movable that could have just been brought to the scene. It could have been transference. It could have been contamination. There's all these caveats, but they're not included in this printout. And people will plead guilty. Cases will proceed on the basis of this kind of one-line statement that there has been a DNA match. And that's already going on because that's cheap and effective.
That's frightening.
I find it frightening.
Yeah, forensic phenotyping, I want to go back to something you were saying earlier, Matthias, and it's really exciting. And I can see why investigators would think, oh, this is going to be really helpful in these no suspect cases where I haven't been able to generate an investigative lead by searching the national criminal DNA databases, right? I don't have anything. Do I have enough sample? Can I go back? Can I test and see who am I looking for? You don't have any CCTV. You don't have anybody saying, oh, the person that attacked me looked like this. Not that eyewitness accounts are very reliable anyways. And when you look at phenotyping, it is okay on the extremes, right? If I'm talking about somebody who has ginger hair and freckles and sunburns, right? Those are 3 of the markers you can look at, versus somebody who's on the other end of the spectrum where they're testing and you can see that they only carry markers for a very dark complexion. And so on the extremes, there's more reliability, but most populations of people are mixtures, right? And if you exclude the caveats from that information, you're doing more damage than good, I would think.
Well, the interesting thing about this type of knowledge is, when is it useful? So there are different ways of talking about what you do with forensic DNA phenotyping and similar technologies, such as biogeographic ancestry testing. Some say, well, it's to reduce the suspect pool, but you're not really reducing the suspect pool. What you're doing is directing the investigation in a different trajectory. And it's often not communicated in such a way. People talk about funneling, talk about reducing, and so on and so forth, but you're prioritizing, you're setting a priority. And it's necessary just even there already to consider the communication. Because if you're closing down some avenues on the basis of such information, which is, as you say, more articulate at the extremes than at the midpoints, where you have a higher number of people. Let's say in Europe, you have a higher number of people with a brownish hair, light brownish hair, and middling skin color, and blue and brown eyes, and everything in between, gray eyes, and so on and so forth. That kind of information is not really that useful. It gives you an idea of where to set your priorities next, but it's not. In the best case, it gives you only that general priority. In the worst case, you take one of these analyses and it points to a minority. And that's really where a lot of those extremely specialized technologies come in, like phenotyping and biogeographic ancestry testing. What you're looking for to use them for is when you're looking for some representatives of a minority. So in Europe, you're looking for someone with really dark skin and really dark hair color and really dark eye color, if you want to use this technology and if it's really useful. Only then is the priority setting making an investigative difference, because you don't have to ask 5,000 people. You might only need to ask 50 people in a particular geographical area. The problem here again is these technologies might have some value, but they also have the chance to create a lot more problems in the way that they're used. So phenotyping should be about appearance, but in the practical application, when you're looking for people in an investigation, you don't necessarily just talk about appearance. You make comparisons and conjectures about where the particular person of interest might be coming from. And in certain countries, certain nationalities will crop up. So in the Netherlands, some years ago, there was this case where 2 young men were caught on camera. So that's not DNA, but that's still visual association of externally visible characteristics. And they were identified in inverted commas as people from North Africa. It turns out later on they were actually Polish citizens. The thinking associated with crime and what a person might look like who might be a person of interest in crime is often associated with certain nationalities. And that's not based on any crime statistics. That is pure and simple bias. It's cultural bias. In Germany, we had a case where people were saying, there are lots of North Africans in the marketplace, and there might be an issue. That was a particular issue around New Year's Eve in Cologne, I think. And it turned out, first of all, these people weren't really an issue, but second of all, they weren't from North Africa. A lot of the people there were from Afghanistan and from Syria and so on and so forth, who just happened to be there. But people were thinking in certain ways. And what's to say that investigators are not subject to those very same cultural biases, and it might lead them to think in a particular way? I can give you the example of the Phantom of Heilbronn, which is a case where a German investigation, which then actually expanded over parts of Europe, forensic DNA phenotyping and biogeographic ancestry testing were used in order to identify perpetrators that were unknown. A police officer was killed and another police officer was injured. And, the potential perpetrator was then chased across Europe. And it turned out that a lot of the DNA that was taken at the crime scene, there were certain markers that came up time and again at other crime scenes in France and Austria and Switzerland and so on and so forth. So the police were thinking, okay, this is a highly mobile criminal doing all kinds of different criminal activities, ranging from murder right down to burglary and theft and so on and so forth. So they were asking Austrian forensic scientists to please do an analysis of the DNA that was found at various different crime scenes. And the Austrian lab did an analysis of forensic DNA phenotype and biogeographic ancestry, and they were saying, okay, what we're seeing here is a female person from Eastern Europe, and we think that's the person that you're looking for. The police interpreted this as, okay, so we have a highly mobile criminal, Eastern Europe, okay, must be from the Sinti and Roma communities. So now we're looking for people from those communities. Now, in the end, it turned out that the DNA that they were chasing in the investigation and that they analyzed belonged to a Polish woman. So the analysis of an Eastern European woman based on phenotyping information, biogeographic ancestry information was fairly correct. However, this woman wasn't a criminal, at least not involved in any of the crimes that the DNA was found at. She worked in the factory that was packaging the cotton swabs that are being used in swabbing. Her swabs were contaminated with her DNA. So the forensic scientists might say, hey, our analysis was successful. We did say it's a person from East Europe. Looks like this and this and this. For the police, of course, it was unsuccessful, this analysis, because it led them in a completely different way. They suspected Roma and Sinti and were looking there. And it turns out, this was not at all relevant, not at all useful for their investigation. So this is a really good example where we can see where technologies might be useful, but they don't have to be. In fact, they can be really quite damaging if they're not used in the correct way.
I remember hearing all about this. I was in the US at the time. So do you think that is it a matter of we shouldn't be using these technologies, or we shouldn't be solely relying on them? So for example, if you're going to go down the track of forensic DNA phenotyping, biogeographical ancestry to help you identify a suspect or to narrow your pool, should you have two different groups working on the investigation, one that's following the genetic investigative lead and another that is remaining with standard investigative techniques that are unaware of the genetic side of things? Because it can be a useful tool in certain circumstances if the recipients of the information are properly informed and understanding all of the caveats, but then you do have that bias effect. So how do you use the technology and prevent the bias?
Yeah, it's a question of training to a degree, but also training of investigators as well as of forensic scientists. Because there are some positive examples of how these kinds of technologies were applied with very careful community relationships applied as well, in the way that the findings were communicated, the findings were followed up on with the Turkish community, where there was a more careful communication by the investigators. So it didn't lead to something that was informed by what you could call moral panic, basically saying, oh my God, here we have this terrible crime, and now we have to use everything in our power, regardless of the damage we might cause, to use it. This is the usual argument of, well, in the balancing of catching a killer, protecting innocence, of course, we have to always on the side of catching the killer. But that's a really unhelpful balance. It's a really unhelpful notion of we have to balance particular rights against each other. So I don't know. I think these technologies can be useful, but they need to be used very, very carefully. And what we're trying in our paper is not to prescribe when and how to use it, these kinds of technologies, even though we do talk about three different types of technologies. We raise the point of what need to be considered in their development and their use. Carol.
Well, one of the things, and you'll be well aware of this, Matthias, is that I'm always asking about effectiveness and almost bringing to the table a sense of realism, which is what we're kind of asking for. Well, there's one important point to make, is that I don't think, and this is very often set up like this, and for my whole career, I've been seen as being pesky or a nuisance because the notion is that I somehow don't want to catch criminals, or somebody once said at a meeting, oh, you're obviously a fan of rapists, which is just, it's nonsense. The idea that if you're on the crime control end of the spectrum, you want to catch criminals and murderers and so forth, that somehow you're on a different end of the spectrum to me, where I actually want things to be done ethically. The two things aren't in conflict. They shouldn't be in conflict. We're not saying don't do these things. Please don't catch these criminals. We're saying, can you do that? But could you do it ethically, please? And also, of course, the important thing is if you do things ethically from the start, you are probably more likely to then end up with an effective technology that's something we can use. If you do something completely unethically, then somebody at some point is going to turn up and go, no, you can't do that. Look what happened with MARPA. We started creating this massive DNA database, putting everybody on it. And then, of course, we had to go, oh, hang on a minute. That's not actually lawful. We're breaching a whole bunch of people's rights there. And we had to row back. So one of the things I would really like is let's learn that lesson and say, let's do this incrementally and do it ethically from the start. Let's not get carried away with ourselves. Let's not think, wow, we're going to catch all these criminals because now we can tell which ones have got ginger hair, because that's just nonsense. The idea we're going to catch a load of criminals because we can tell which ones have ginger hair and blue eyes.
The gingers already have enough problems as it is.
And let's be realistic about effectiveness as well, because let's think broadly about, we have to make priority decisions about where we invest our resources. So is this a sensible place to invest our time and resources, or is there something that could be more effective that would actually solve more crimes and so forth? So yes, and I think, of course, these technologies are probably, you mentioned no suspect cases or what we call cold cases. And yes, it's vital that we have technologies that we can bring to bear on these cold cases, because it's awful that there's murders that go unsolved. But do we then roll out or say, oh, we can do photo fits of criminals now and so forth, and spin this kind of idea that we can do things that aren't going to be of general use, that they are very limited, they are very expensive and time consuming, and are really only of limited use? That, I think, becomes almost a societal question then. Do I want my resources for the policing and the criminal justice system put in these technologies, or actually are there other priorities? Because if money was limitless, if resources were unlimited, yes, go for it, as long as you're doing it ethically and so forth. But that's not realistic. So all these questions, they're not in conflict to being ethical and catching criminals. You can catch criminals, but you have to do it ethically. And there are societal questions that I think you can't oversell this technology as being a silver bullet that is, I've done a lot of work with other people as well, Aaron and Manquart, about the effectiveness of the DNA database. And when you actually have a conversation with people about how many people they think we are catching using just conventional DNA testing, they wildly overestimate it, because we've been sold this idea that DNA testing, for a start, is objective, reliable, infallible, and so forth, which is not true. And that somehow we're catching all these criminals, and that's not true either.
I mean, we are catching some, and in some cases, a lot of post-conviction testing where people are exonerated, and you find the true perpetrator was actually in the database for some small petty crime, and you just didn't identify them.
Yeah. One of the most frustrating things, of course, is that we do have this technology, and sometimes, frustratingly, it isn't used to good effect. I mean, we had a massive case here years ago. A young mother was murdered horrifically in a park in front of her toddler, Rachel Nickel, on Wimbledon Common. And we got criminal profilers involved, and it was this whole big investigation, which basically we ended up putting on trial the wrong guy. Meanwhile, all the time, there was a suspect. He'd been named by his own grandmother. He was known to have committed other crimes and so forth, and he should have been a suspect. And the police just kept somehow never quite getting round to taking his DNA. So they went to his house even, and he wasn't in. So they just left again. And then, so there was all this that went on. Meanwhile, we're busy prosecuting an innocent guy who fortunately was not convicted. But yeah, it took ages for us to actually get around to taking the DNA and testing it of this guy who seemed an obvious suspect. And then, of course, it matched. And in the interim, he had killed another mother and her daughter. So because of the tardiness or whatever it was about the police didn't get around to taking the DNA of this suspect, another couple of people died. So it is frustrating. So it isn't just the technology. You have to make sure it's being used properly. So, the systems are integrated. So if you have a suspect, that you take his DNA and that it's tested, because otherwise all the technology and laboratories in the world are wonderful. But if they're not being used properly, I always go back to the wonderful metaphor that was used by Ken Peace and Tin Lewis said about the sandwich. If you've got a wonderful filling, DNA testing, but 2 slices of stale bread, which is policing and the trial system, you've still got a rubbish sandwich. So you've got to get rid of the stale bread.
I think I'm going to have to title this episode "A Stale Sandwich."
I hope not.
You touched on a lot of things in there. It doesn't do you any good to have this amazing technology if you're misusing it and prosecuting the wrong person. I mean, like you said, we miss things and more people end up dying because you're focused in the wrong direction, because you're not understanding, or you're misapplying, or you're overstating what this technology means.
Yeah, I mean, we have had the odd case in the UK, more so in the US. There was a wonderful case here where a guy got convicted of a robbery, quite a serious robbery, because there was basically a chase. He was caught wearing these trainers, and these trainers then matched at the crime scene, the tread, the footwear impressions and so forth. And he swore blind that someone had been running away and stopped him and made him put these trainers on. That does sound like a crazy story, I admit. You go, yeah, right, that happens all the time. People come up to me in the street and tell me to swap shoes with them. But it turned out the guy got convicted. Do you know what? It turned out to be true, that they did DNA testing on the inside of these trainers, and they matched it to another guy who, had a string of robberies and was matched because they had a description as being like a 6 foot tall black man. And this was like a 5 foot tall white guy that was convicted. So we overlooked that bit because the trainers sort of thing. And who would have said, oh, let's DNA test the trainers? It was only when the guy was in prison and he'd lost all his appeals that a lawyer went, okay, let's do this testing. And yeah, he was subsequently exonerated. Obviously, for exoneration cases and so forth, we've had many cases where DNA can exonerate people. Obviously, it would be preferable if we could exonerate, just not convict them in the first place.
Yes.
Would be far preferable.
Well, even all of these technologies that we're talking about, whether we're talking about traditional DNA profiling with STRs or some of these newer technologies and newer methodologies like the forensic genetic genealogy and all that sort of things, you kind of forgetting the fundamental fact that just because somebody's DNA is on something is not equivalent to them having actually committed a crime, that the source of the DNA is completely separate from the activity, and it has to be considered as a separate, mutually exclusive proposition.
I mean, we do have not rules as such, but a convention, let's say, that you cannot convict somebody with DNA evidence alone, okay? But that has been stretched in some instances to, well, we've got your DNA on something suspicious, and actually you can't explain it, and you've got previous convictions, you're a bit of a dodgy character, and we don't have any other evidence, but hey, let's ask a jury. And if you can't convince a jury there's a viable explanation for why your DNA is on this, then well, a jury convicted you and there must have been something else. So it can be stretched, yeah. But convicting people on DNA alone, I think, should always be a no-no. If somebody's guilty of a crime and all we can find is a DNA match, that's got to raise a question.
That goes back to what you were saying earlier, Matthias, about the context, stressing the context being important. I've always told the prosecutors, when I get a pretrial meeting, you cannot consider your DNA evidence in a vacuum. And if that's all you have, you don't have enough. So whether or not that gets across to people, I don't know, because a lot of times they have a pretrial meeting, everybody accepts the DNA, and you don't even know how the case turns out. So sometimes it's not exactly fair to the person that's doing the work in the lab. They're excluded from either side of that sandwich, and maybe they should be more included in those parts of the process to help guide the investigators and the prosecutors to make sure that they really are understanding the information they're trying to give them.
Yeah, I mean, that's a good point about this misconception of substantive equivalence. So yes, profiling and databasing and simple matching is quite well developed, highly reliable. That doesn't necessarily mean that other DNA-based technologies are as equally well developed and as equally highly reliable. So just to say we've got the DNA and that's what we can say this is, that doesn't hold if you've just got trace that might give you information on what a person might look like, or that is highly reliant on cultural denominators, such as geographical ancestry ideas. That's to say that someone might come from East Asia, say. It's in itself not that really useful unless you're looking for people whom you imagine to look like what we think are East Asians. And that's a cultural assumption of what an East Asian person might look like. So we need to be careful in thinking about, DNA technology isn't the same as any other DNA technology. The substantive equivalence isn't something we can assume just because DNA matching works, DNA phenotyping or forensic genetic genealogy or forensic epigenetics is something that we can use quite as confidently as DNA profiling generally. I think that it's quite important to keep that in mind. And what's quite important is in the public debate might get lost, this idea that these are new technologies which are not the same as existing technologies. These are emerging technologies, genetic genealogy. Yes, we have a few cases where they have worked, but how many cases exist that they haven't worked in? We don't really know because failures are not communicated. We tend to hear about individual successes, and that can be really, really good and helpful. But it would be good to know about the failures as well, the phantoms of Heilbronn where different technologies have not worked. I'm not saying that these are not being discussed in the scientific community. I'm pretty sure they are, but they're not communicated to those who might be under the impression that these new and emerging technologies are just as reliable as existing DNA technologies. And I think that's an issue. That's a problem that we have seen time and again in public debates where expectations have been raised quite significantly without consideration for the detrimental effects on policing, on the perception of science in policing, on the perception of the legitimacy of policing using certain technologies, even on the perception of those people who might be subject to the use of these technologies. So that's not, as Karen was saying earlier, we want to protect the rapists and the killers. This is completely wrong. These technologies can be useful, but if you don't use them carefully, they can cause a lot more harm where innocent people get hurt or even killed. And then you have another case of a murder, which might have been caused by someone taking the information in the wrong way. For example, police officers in the US shooting at someone because they are black and they're holding a mobile phone in their hand.
What you're saying there, actually, not the part about the person with the mobile phone, but the information about the using this new technology, it does harken back to the beginning of DNA databases with just the DNA profiles in them to generate investigative leads. And the argument that exists and continues to exist in the US, there have been several pieces of legislation around it where if we'd had this technology available to us, we would have prevented 8 rapes from happening. And now it's with rapid DNA. You can have people's DNA samples collected at intake at the custody suites, and you can immediately search that person, generate a DNA profile, and search it against the database and identify somebody as soon as they're arrested as being linked to these crimes, rather than waiting through laboratory backlogs to get this information to happen. And you can use it for crime prevention, as well as making sure you've got one aspect of catching the correct person rather than going 200 miles down the wrong road and looking for the wrong person and wasting a lot of resources and stuff. I think some of the things that you're saying you're talking about the ethics and following the right process to ensure the integrity of the investigations. And by highlighting these issues, you're not saying that you want this rapist to go free. You're saying you want to catch the person who's actually is the rapist and not this other guy who happened to be running down the street and somebody made him put him on a pair of trainers.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely.
I know I'm mixing up our stories there, right? But in your paper, I'm conscious of the time now, so I wanted to say in your paper on the ethics as a lived practice, you highlight 3 key lessons to help forensic geneticists navigate the future with all of these technologies as they continue to develop. Would you like to share and touch on those?
Sure. Yeah. Let me just preface this with the rationale for the paper really was we can see, which is really good, a lot of technical harmonization with existing forensic DNA technologies as well as emerging ones. There's a harmonization of methodology and analysis approaches across forensic laboratories and service providers. Not all, but responsible service providers, they share the same kind of information. They share the kinds of methodologies that they're using, and they're disclosing them. And what we need really is also a shared strong ethical code across forensic laboratories, across forensic service providers. Just as there is a shared kind of approach to methodology, there should be a shared, like a strong universal ethical code. And the way that we approach ethics as a consideration of standards of rights and obligations, and that applies to scientists and their rights and their obligations as scientists. So the 3 lessons that we boiled the conversation and the paper down to were, the first one is really to think ahead, and we call this anticipatory capacity, to be able to anticipate, not to expect, but to anticipate based on experiences, based on awareness and based on communication with others, the kind of impacts of research and forensic work. So scientists need to be able to anticipate how technologies will impact on individuals and on groups of people who might be drawn into investigations. And they also need to consider wider community relationships and criminal justice more generally. So it's really, really important to embed forensic science and forensic genetics within the criminal justice system and within society. It's not something that exists outside of these two. And often we kind of see this saying, oh no, this is science, this is objective, this is facts. But this is scientific information generated by human beings within society, for society, within the criminal justice system. So it's really, really important here that forensic geneticists, and that's the first point again, need to engage with ethics in all stages of the data life cycle. And they need to be able to think ahead. The second point is that it's really important to think about the power of these technologies to cast suspicion. And I think it's always seen as something really positive, which it is, but it can also have unintended consequences. So it's really, really important to think about the power of forensic genetics, forensic epigenetics, to cast suspicion over a wide range of individuals and communities. For example, those who may share visual characteristics or family ancestry or lifestyle habits. And forensic geneticists need to be aware of the active role that their research and technologies can play in either strengthening or threatening fundamental legal principles such as the presumption of innocence, the equality of arms, and the legal burden of proof. The third point is about clarity and open communication, about the real world capacities of technologies, such as the ones we've discussed today, which is really, really important, and which we often don't see that clarity and open communication about how these technologies what they can deliver outside of an ideal case laboratory proof of principle situation and just a testing where you already know the answers and you're just trying to see what you come to. These are important, these kinds of tests, but we also need to see examples from work with samples from outside. And those are happening, but we need the clear communication here about the limitations. Yeah. So the point really is clear articulation of technologies. And that helps to build legitimacy and public trust around these technologies and around the work of forensic science, forensic genetics that it can contribute and deliver in criminal justice context.
Yeah, we didn't touch that much on the epigenetic side of the lifestyle choices, but I'm going to put a link to this paper in the show notes so people will be able to read the full information that you guys have worked so hard to put together.
Thank you.
And I know that you've also been building on a lot of the principles in here and continue to do work around these areas. I guess I'm already talking to you. Do you have any closing remarks? And then I'll pass it over to Carol and let her have opportunities.
Well, I brought a lot of the important points together just in the summary. But what I also want to say is ethics, and I think that's a really important point. Ethics is not the law. Ethics is not religion. Ethics is not what society accepts. Ethics is not, I feel, therefore that's right. Ethics is about principle-led reasoning about actions. It's about standards of rights and of how one should behave. And that's really, really important. Just because something is legal doesn't necessarily mean it is ethically sound to do, doesn't necessarily mean it's legitimate to do. It's a really, really important point that I want to kind of add on to the summary of the paper that you kindly gave me the time to do.
Absolutely. My pleasure. Carol, did you have anything?
Yeah, I think they're really important points to end on. And just really a plea that this is an ongoing conversation. The point about
Absolutely.
Communication and that we're not trying to delegate that, all forensic geneticists have to be ethical and it's all up to them. We want to be involved. All the slices of bread in the sandwich and the fillings should all be working together. So this is a conversation that should be broad ranging, involve lots of people. Like, I'm a lawyer, Matthias, a social scientist and so forth. But forensic geneticists are a key part of the conversation. And I would urge them to join other conversations, but also invite us into your conversations and likewise, so that it's really exciting. And yes, we all want to catch criminals. So let's just see how best can we do that. And this is taking that conversation forward. It's not trying to hamper it or slow anybody down. So yeah, I hope that, it's not seen as challenging, but actually exciting.
Yeah, I'm hoping that with this episode, we'll be helping start that conversation and make sure that people in the field know that experts like yourselves are available and happy to help when we come across these difficult decisions. So we've solidified the science. We know what the limitations are for pristine samples. We don't know what it's going to happen to it when it goes out into the wild. And maybe we can't conceptualize those because we don't have the same foundation in the social aspects of the implications of what we're doing. And we need help. We need external help in a lot of those areas. And well, hopefully you guys will actually start having more people in the genetics field reaching out to you and talking to you. I know you've done some collaborative work and interdisciplinary work before, and hopefully this will continue along that line of conversation. I will be sharing your biographies and links to a lot of your publications, and especially with some of the, we talked about the Newfield report. And also I want to link to some of the other papers that you guys have done and the interdisciplinary work with EUROFORGEN and things like that too. So with that, thank you guys very much for taking the time out of your schedule to be on the show today. I really do appreciate it. And if in the future you guys have some more work you'd like to share, I would be more than happy to have you back again. I really enjoyed the conversation, and I think we probably could talk for a couple more, at least another hour on this topic. But thank you again.
Thank you.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.
Absolutely.